My name is Dina Awad. I'm a senior associate in the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group. I practice civil and regulatory litigation. I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. I'm also the chair of the Roundtable of Diversity Associations, which is a group of diversity-seeking legal associations that seek to advance equity in law. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panel today. At Dentons, inclusion and diversity is not just a core value, it's an integral part of our strategy. In today's globalized world, which is changing faster than ever before, we understand the critical role that inclusive and diverse teams play, both in helping us make better decisions, innovating faster, and delivering more sophisticated client solutions. Today, our panelists will discuss how effective inclusion of diverse lived experiences and perspectives drive innovation, creativity, and empower organizations to think differently, retain the best talent, and enable business strategies to adapt to the shifting dynamics of a global market. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our amazing panelists. I'll start at the end. We've got Chris Pennington, who's the Canada Chair of Dentons Canada and CEO of Next Law In-House Solutions. Right next to him, we've got Bindu Kujo, who's the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary for the Canadian Western Bank Financial Group. Next to Bindu, we've got Jillian Akai, who is the Chief Administrative Officer, Executive Vice President, and General Counsel at Post Media Network, Inc. We're also proud to call her a Dentons alum. And finally, last but not least, we've got Deepshika Dutt, partner in Dentons Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group and co-chair of Dentons Toronto Inclusion and Diversity Network. For further details about the great work and breadth of experience of our amazing panelists, please be sure to pick up a copy of our bios page. With that, I will hand things over to our lovely panelists.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump into this. Before we get into conversation, I think it's important to orient all of ourselves as to why we're here, what is diversity and inclusion, and what is the business case. It's no longer just about ticking boxes on a piece of paper and saying we have two women, two people from a different race and background. It's about creating a culture from top to bottom where everybody feels included. And that's the definition of diversity and inclusion. It is to create that feeling of belongingness in any organization. It is to include people in their day-to-day activities and make them feel like they belong and are part of that office, that community, that country, that place. And that's what is diversity and inclusion to us at Dentons and to everyone around us. Why is it so important, and what is the business case? I don't think it's any longer disputed that diversity and inclusion create an environment where ideas thrive, where innovation thrives, and where it leads to actual, tangible financial improvement in organizations that are more diverse and more innovative. I don't think it can be disputed at all that it leads to better financial results, it leads to better performance and growth of an organization if it is more diverse and more inclusive. With that, I'm going to turn to our panel, and maybe Bindu, we can start with you. You're in an industry where banking industry is sort of on the front lines. You can be from any race, you can be from any background, you can be from any economic stature in the society. You end up needing a financial institution. You go. There's no escaping you guys. And we've seen, and at least from the outset, I've always seen the banking industry to be on the forefront of inclusion and diversity. In your experience, how have you seen that change over a period of time? And what sort of pros and cons have you seen of diversity and inclusion over your time?
So I think you're right. By definition of who we are and who our clients are, we are trying to appeal to sort of the broadest base when I talk about banking generally. And as a result, we end up often hiring, certainly at the front lines, folks that reflect the communities that we serve. I think some of the challenges in banking, and there's a lot of colleagues in the room who I know work in the financial services industry, is to see that diversity moves up and throughout the organization, so that the leadership in all kinds of sectors of it, within the business lines, but also in some of the control functions and otherwise, reflect the customers that we serve. But I think you're absolutely right. The business case for diversity has been made. We want to sort of appeal to the breadth of clients that we're seeking to attract to us, and we know that not only does our staff have to sort of reflect the communities that we're in, but we attract the best people to come join our company. We attract more clients that way, and I think what has been really heartening over the last number of years is sort of appreciating the fact that we get the best thinking and the most innovation coming to us when we bring together a diverse group of individuals and diversity of all kinds of things, right? Not gender, race, thinking, professional training, age, all of these pieces, and we're seeing that sort of increasingly sort of filter up through the organization. So
we see that here as well, where it is so important to retain talent now, to have a diverse talent in the first place, right? Like you can no longer just attract talent if you don't have that. If people don't see themselves reflected from top to bottom, you're losing out on great thinkers, innovators, and you no longer are able to attract those. So definitely, that's a really good point. And Jillian, you have been in an industry which has seen disruption that I can't even begin to explain, from people spending hours, including my dad. I remember sitting in the porch and reading like newspapers, to now me getting my news in 124 characters or less. It's an industry that has gone through huge change. Have you seen diversity and inclusion contribute to that change? How has it helped the industry to sort of grow and develop?
Yeah, so I think that our industry is, as you said, it's an industry in intense disruption. And the interesting thing about it was, I joined many years ago. At the outset, when I joined, we had a pretty homogenous leadership team. Senior leadership was very consistent in terms of background, skill set. I mean, frankly, I would say, we had many folks who had been paper boys and girls, and that's how they had moved up, become journalists, editors, publishers, and so on. You have a set of people with a very consistent life experience, skill set, educational background, socioeconomic class, all of those things. And I think it worked for a long time because that expertise worked within an industry that was not disrupted, that was stable and proceeding along nicely. In disruption, what occurred, at least from what I saw, was the organization realized we are not responding as an industry or an organization to this disruption. What do we need to do to be able to respond more quickly, more creatively, because what we're doing is not working. And it was, obviously there's no silver bullet and no easy answers, but I believe that the industry as a whole, but certainly our organization, took a very focused effort on saying we need to look beyond our existing ranks, outside of our industry, look at people who have different experiences, as I said, professional experiences, professional education, industry experiences, to say what can we learn from these other places to help us respond within our industry. And I think it's been, it feels relatively fast to me, but maybe other people might disagree. The rate of change that I've seen in the organization, at this point, our senior leadership team is it's incredibly diverse in my view, by all of the sort of groups and dimensions that Bindu talked about. So I've seen it become I mean, I think we've responded by need. I'd like to say that we did it for all altruistic reasons, but I do think that it was need that pushed us, and it's become, a part of who we are, and I think a great result for our organization.
Yeah, for sure. You either adapt or you become extinct, right? That's, and changing technologies, changing mindsets, changing cultures necessitate that you adopt diversity and inclusion of all kinds and bring that talent in if you want to be successful in the 21st century. Yeah, for sure. And Chris, you have been in an industry which is not known for its nimbleness. It's
Oh my God.
it's a traditionalist profession. But you have been a sponsor and a mentor and believer and follower of diversity and inclusion. When did you recognize sort of the benefit of that, and what did you see the need and the thing that the organization could gain from adopting diversity and inclusion?
I'd like to put it in personal terms, if I may, and start by talking about something that we'll come back to, I know, later in our conversation. But for me, it's always been fundamentally, the business case, by the way, is clearly made. And I will say to all of our colleagues and our clients in the room, it's particularly important, and I'm not being cynical in saying this, it's important for us at Dentons because it's important to all of our clients. And what's important to our clients should certainly be important to their service providers. But for me, it's always been fundamentally a matter of fairness and equity at a very visceral and personal level. It is what we should be standing for as a profession and as lawyers, to uphold those principles of fairness and equity. But I want to talk about what some would call perceived advantage. I call simply privilege. I'm in a different position on this panel. I am a senior white male. I'm a WASP. I've been married for almost 40 years in a very traditional family. I have 4 wonderful children, 4 wonderful grandchildren. I have had the privilege of being able to devote myself to my career without distraction throughout. I went to the right school. I went to the right college. I joined the right fraternity. I went to the right law school. And when I graduated, I was welcomed into a profession that looked, and still, unfortunately, too much looks like me, and came from where I came from. And that gave me extraordinary access and sponsorship throughout my career. Now, that may sound unfair. We all bring our own personal backgrounds and experience to the conversation. I firmly believe, though, that we all have a responsibility and a tremendous opportunity to leverage for collective benefit and the benefit of others, whatever elements of privilege we bring to the conversation. And so I have always believed, and I feel a passion about it. It excites me. It's a great motivation for me. Because I think the first job of leaders is to sponsor and celebrate the success of others. Fundamentally, that's what it's about. And the way to do that is through inclusion. The way to do that is to seek out and leverage, identify and sponsor opportunities to, if you will, try to level the playing field, to promote and encourage others to take some chances, to expand their horizons, and to be ultimately successful. The benefits from a business perspective, and Bindu and Jillian have already spoken to this, I think are clear. But from a personal perspective, it's very much a two-way street. And I have found that I get at least as much from a personal perspective, I don't mean selfishly, but from a personal business perspective, well, psychologically as well, at least as much as I put into it. And yes, it does mean sometimes stepping outside your comfort zone and showing a little bit of humility, which lawyers are not particularly well known for, and a little bit of vulnerability, which we're certainly not known for, because we're typically very non-resilient or unresilient. And as I say, stepping out your comfort zone. I've always found it more beneficial to surround myself with difference. That can be challenging to manage divergent views, but it helps to avoid the groupthink that too often takes hold, and it is something that we need to strike back against in our legal profession. I'll leave it there for now, but I do think that it is clearly rewarding and impactful from a business perspective in terms of talent retention and promotion, as you've highlighted. It's important in terms of reflecting, as Bindu was saying, reflecting your customers, reflecting our customers, aligning with them. But fundamentally, I come back to the fundamental notion of fairness and equity.
Absolutely, and I think some of the privileges that you mentioned, being a white male, those are privileges that you're born with, that aren't really in your control, so to speak. I think what is great is when people recognize that and use them to the benefit of creating that equity and fairness, because you can't change that about yourself. It's how you utilize those and reflect that in your day-to-day, which is really what differentiates a leader and a sponsor from someone who's not. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. And so I think there is no doubt, and I think all of us in the room would agree to the business case of inclusion and diversity. So the question really is then, how do you create that team of diverse people, that dream team, so to speak, that can lead to innovative ideas, that can create better thinking environment, innovation. And one of the projects that was done was by Google, Project Aristotle. And I'm just going to play a quick video by Charles Duhigg, who is a journalist and author of Smarter, Faster, Better. It's a book, if you haven't read it, about how the secret of how to increase productivity in your day-to-day life by diversity, inclusion, motivation, and things like that. And he spent some time working with the team of Project Aristotle, and he shares some thoughts as to how to create that dream team.
One of the biggest questions is how to build the perfect team. And in fact, about 4 years ago, Google invited me to come spend some time with them because they were in the middle of a big project called Project Aristotle, a huge data study to try and figure out how to build the perfect team at Google. Initially, their hypothesis was that the best teams are teams where you put people together who like each other, right? Maybe you need a good mix of extroverts and introverts. Maybe you need people who are friends away from the conference room. And so they looked at the data and they did experiments, and they found that who was on a team actually didn't matter at all. They couldn't find any correlations between team membership and team success. So then they started looking at how a team interacts. And this is where suddenly everything became clear. Because what they found is that the people who are on a team matter much, much less than how those people interact. That you could have enemies on a team together, or you could have strangers or friends or people who don't get along, or all introverts or all extroverts. And as long as they treat each other a certain way, as long as there's a certain culture, then that team will gel. So as they started looking at these behaviors, what they found was that there were two in particular that mattered more than anything else. The first was called equality in conversational turn-taking. During a meeting or a set of meetings, if everyone speaks at roughly the same amount, then that team is much more likely to succeed. But just speaking isn't actually enough. The second characteristic that teams need in order to do well is called ostentatious listening. That basically, in addition to encouraging you to talk more, I, as a team leader or team member, have to show you that I'm listening by doing things like repeating what you just told me or closing my computer so I can make eye contact with you. If you have these two characteristics, conversational turn-taking and ostentatious listening, it creates what psychologists refer to as psychological safety. And psychological safety is shown as the single greatest correlate with a group's success. When a group feels like they are psychologically safe with each other, you unlock their best ideas, their ability to work together, their innovative capacities. Google's fundamental belief, as is true for many other companies, is that it's only when a team comes together that you actually get the best ideas out of each person and the best work at getting things done.
So I think, as we said in the beginning, I think it's no longer just about the number, right? Like, it's no longer just about creating a team of people who look the same or talk the same or are from same backgrounds. It's about actually inculcating that culture through creating an environment where you are fostering the ideas of innovation. And Jillian, if I can start with you, do you agree and do you see this in your organization? And how do you see it play out?
I would say I absolutely see that the team, a diverse team, based on all the dimensions we've talked about, because it's really a variety of those dimensions. Like I include age, skill, professional designation or background, industry background. Like it's a wide range of staff other than the sort of obvious designated diversity dimensions that we kind of consistently talk about. But when you have that kind of diversity, to me, there's some strong advantages, but there's some disadvantages as well that you have to address. But some of the disadvantages I'd say Chris referenced. One is it's a less comfortable conversation. Like when you are in a room with a bunch of people who have a very similar life experience, you shorthand conversation. You don't have to explain your perspective as much. You don't end up challenging other people's perspectives the same way, or their biases or their assumptions. Those kinds of things can be difficult. They make the conversation longer. Meetings are longer. Decision making takes longer. You have to involve more people. All of those things can be challenging, and that's been my experience. I sort of sometimes think, wow, there are 10 people in this room. Do we really all have to be here talking about this? The advantage is obviously what I've seen is the sort of effectiveness that results from people from different, taking whatever perspective or dimension that they come from and challenging the views of others. That only works if that group has that psychological safety in the video. But you have to really trust the people that you're talking to. If you don't have that, ego starts to get in your way, discomfort starts to get in your way. You start to be able to become unable to hear, which is one of the things we were talking about, and listen, because you are getting caught up in your own, I'm uncomfortable with this conversation, or I'm being challenged in a way that I'm not comfortable with, any of those things. When you have a safe environment, everybody's able to bring that different perspective and challenge the thinking of the others in that group in a way that gets you to a better result, right? Like that is innovation.
Absolutely.
So anyway, we've seen it, I think, certainly, I think that it's been effective within our organization. I would give the example, because I know we're talking to a room full of lawyers. I think it's, having a lawyer at that senior table making business decisions is not something that happens at every organization, but it is an element of using diversity to the business's advantage. Having a lawyer at the table brings a different perspective. Now, they may not want to hear it all the time, but it brings a different perspective. It challenges the business's assumptions and views. And you know what? The same is true for me. I will say the business challenges me on a regular basis. Why do we have to do it this way? What do you mean securities laws? Those kinds of things.
Why are they important
at
all?
Exactly. Is that a real thing? But there's nothing wrong with them asking me those questions. It forces me to think through my perspective and not kind of rest on my laurels and say, hey, FMC and Denton's taught me that securities laws are important. It forces me to think through my position and challenge my thinking and give them sort of the best legal advice I can.
Absolutely, and I find even when we are talking to clients, it forces you to be practical. And that is what I find is the key when, especially as lawyers, because you're trained to, write long memos and you're trained to think through everything and you're risk averse, so you want to protect, you're behind all the time in every memo, but it forces you to be practical. Like, why does it really matter to have a securities law? Why does it matter that I need in a contract an indemnity provision or things like that, which is a diversity of thought, which is equally important in a team for it to grow and be innovative. And so, Bindu, do you see things like, I find as lawyers, especially the characteristic of ostentatious listening is mostly missing in most lawyers.
I was going to say.
It's the sound of their own voice. How do you see those characteristics sort of translate into your profession, and when you're building teams, how do you see that reflected?
Frequently, unfortunately. I think there's a bit, unfortunately, I think a lot of lawyers see their value as being the source of answers. And I think when we stop and start at thinking we have to know the answer, and okay, I got this, like the answer is yes. Usually it's no, let's be clear, we're lawyers. But and when you stop and start there, you're not listening, you're not really paying attention. I had, my old boss told me that, most of the time, the question you were being asked is not really the question that somebody has, right? And you can only get to that if you are listening carefully, if you are asking questions, if you are using that environment of psychological safety and making people feel comfortable. But I think what I've learned working now in two banks is that people are intimidated by lawyers, right? They often think we have way more power than we do. We don't actually have the ability to stop you from doing anything. I'm not allowed to touch the money in the vault or at the bank machine or in the branches, which is very disappointing to me. I know.
Why do we have you here?
I know, right? So I actually can't stop you from doing things. I can give you advice and tell you maybe that's not the best way to do it. But sometimes they're afraid of bringing the issue up. They're afraid of sanction. They're afraid of censure. They don't even know that it's an issue, right? So how do we create an environment where people aren't afraid to call the legal department or get to know their lawyers or ask them questions? And I think it goes to the concept of psychological safety, right? And how do you create that where you might have some intimidation factors about education or training or the big words that you use, or I think we should put it out there, social class, right? Most lawyers are living in a different position in society than maybe the rest of your colleagues in terms of the neighborhoods that you live in and the activities that you do, et cetera. So how do we create a place where we can have a conversation about our collective interest, right? Lining up to the goals that we have, what we're trying to achieve as a company, and have those conversations to say, I'm not here to actually stop you from doing good things, and let me be enthusiastic about this. Let me be interested in what you're doing. But that comes with listening, and it comes from sharing a perspective and being willing to share your perspective. I would say the lawyers who struggle the most in this space aren't very interested in having a dialogue, so there's a lot of hiding behind email and one-way transactional communication as opposed to sort of having the conversation, whether that's in person or over the phone. And they're not interested necessarily in feedback on the advice that they give. Lawyers are phenomenal at catastrophizing. Like, this is what we have, went to school for and spent our whole career. It was thinking about the worst possible outcome from every single situation. But most people in the world who are trying to be accretive and help the world don't really want to think about everything that's going to go wrong. And you got to find a balance. So, I think there's, of course, a role for that ability to kind of imagine disaster ahead of us, but it shouldn't be the reason we stop doing things, right? What I think we let ourselves down as lawyers is when we don't help come to a solution for how to address the risk that we see, or to apply our judgment to say that maybe while it is a risk, it's not the only risk, it's not the most meaningful risk.
Absolutely. In fact, I think most businesses, in order to succeed, you have to be risk takers. You have to be innovators. You have to think outside the box.
We get paid for.
Which is completely the opposite of our trading, where you're always finding risk in everything, identifying any loophole that you can, what can go wrong, as you said, thinking about the worst case scenario. So it's an interesting sort of diversity of perspective that as lawyers we bring to the businesses, to our clients, and to create that balance in team where you can bounce off those ideas and actually challenge your thinking about, well, is it really a risk in the real world, or is it a law question, examination question that I'm answering now by writing all the risks that can possibly arise out of this transaction? So definitely, that's a huge part of that is listening.
Yeah.
And Chris, so the studies have sort of confirmed that having, for example, more women on a team who
That's how you get stuff done, right, Chris?
I know.
Oh, there you go.
They're better.
I'm glad you lobbed it my way, because I was just about to.
Better EQ, better IQ, just better general. It promotes.
You knew this was going to go this way.
know.
Yeah.
I mean, you are the minority on this.
I am.
So how does that sort of translate, and how do you see that affecting? Yeah.
Well, if I may,
Yes,
I'd
absolutely.
like, because everybody can see the right-hand side of the slide, which we haven't talked about yet, and I
Yeah.
think that it's my role,
Yes.
being that one male on the stage, to talk about this. So in a very comparable way or aligned way with the Google Aristotle projects, MIT Carnegie Mellon did a study a few years ago. They had about just under 700 volunteers grouped in teams of 5 to 10, quite randomly. assigned a series of sort of everyday tasks, playing checkers against a computer, building models, sort of team activities. And similar to the Aristotle findings, it wasn't collective IQ, it wasn't anything about the composition of the team that determined success, but what they found was a consistent pattern of a team that excelled in one task, excelled in multiple tasks, if not all of the tasks. And they came to, as I say, similar to conclusions, that the drivers of a high-performing team with creative and innovative output were firstly the social sensitivity of the group. And they measured that through a very interesting test that you can take online called reading the mind through the eyes. Literally where you see pictures of, and maybe some of you have taken it, you see pictures of eyes and you're asked to interpret the emotion or the state of mind of the individual. And those who scored, teams that sort of in aggregate scored high on that social sensitivity tended to perform better. Conversation is not dominated by a few group members. Equality of time, of turn taking, similar to the Aristotle, which we've already talked about. And then demographics, which actually translates into percentage of women. More women on the team, more productive, more innovative, high-performing teams. Interestingly, there's a very strong correlation between the results on social sensitivity. Women typically score higher on reading the mind through the eyes than men do. So I wanted to make sure that I emphasized that. And so,
couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I thought it was safe to say all of those things on this stage. I happen to fundamentally believe that. And I won't sort of go further with that, but going back to some of the earlier part of the conversation, and again, I'm sort of personalizing this, but there is an important role for senior white males to play in creating this environment of psychological safety. In fact, I think that's fundamentally what it is all about. And it really does take consistent self-awareness, and as I said earlier, a healthy dose of humility and vulnerability. None of us is perfect. We all make mistakes. We're far more likely to identify the mistakes and rectify them if we have that diversity of thought and perspective brought into the conversation. But it can take shape in many ways. Not sitting at the head of the table, not speaking first. I know that somebody that you've worked with closely never speaks first. We'll always wait to hear what the room has to say.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a very powerful tool. So there are sort of everyday habits in terms of how you engage, and that ostentatious listening, not looking at your iPhone, which we're all guilty of. We're all guilty of it. Although I'm looking around and no one's actually looking at their iPhone. So thank you for your undivided attention.
Nice.
Engaging speakers.
But it's just dealing with people in that most fundamental of personal ways and treating and respecting everybody as an individual. And I know that sounds a little high-minded or a little mushy, but it is fundamentally the case. We all know that we perform best, individually and as a group, when we are able to bring our authentic whole selves to work and to the task of the day. That's what creates the environment of psychological safety, that a mistake is an opportunity to learn. It's not an opportunity or a need to recriminate, to find fault. Yeah. That's fundamental to innovation, for sure. And so it's and I very much support, and I think something that we can do, and we are doing much more in Dentons, here in Toronto and across the firm globally, is involving that diversity of thought across business services beyond the traditional realm of the lawyers who, we've got this. We weren't trained as managers and executives in law school. Many have developed those skills, but we have an extraordinarily talented team, again, here in Toronto, across Canada and around the world, of business professionals who support us in our business, who, by the way, our clients are extremely interested in talking to, because that's how we drive an innovation agenda. And if I may just go on very briefly. I had said that I wasn't going to say anything on this panel, so
that was the challenge.
That was the challenge.
That's a promise.
Did not work.
But I'd like to share, our Dentons colleagues will be aware of this, but I'd like to share what I think is a fascinating experiment that we undertook within Dentons globally. It's literally wrapping up this week at a global board meeting in Madrid, actually, as we speak, which is really about leveraging inclusion and diversity to develop innovative ideas around inclusion and diversity, if you're with me. A year ago, we had what we called the Big Inclusion Conversation, which was a 72-hour chatathon around the globe where members of our firm, and when I say members of the firm, all 17,000 members of Dentons were invited and did actively participate. It wasn't just lawyers, it was everybody in every corner of the globe across our 175 locations. And out of that, and it was really energizing to be part of it, and out of that we developed a whole series of themes, recurring themes and ideas around flexible working arrangements, around talent and performance, around driving engagement. So this year we've just wrapped up what we called the Big Inclusion Project. And the idea was to bring forward those themes from the Big Inclusion conversation and to invite members of the firm, again, across the entire cross-section of 17,000 members of Dentons, to participate on teams. We were happily wildly oversubscribed. I mean, I think we ended up with about 24 teams of 10 people, cutting across different levels of lawyer, but also different parts of the organization across geographies. And people sort of opted for the general theme that they would like to participate in. So we had over 240 people on the teams. Each team had an assigned theme, had a global board member sponsor assigned, an internal Dentons diversity champion, and an outside expert. And I had the privilege and the pleasure of serving on as a champion on two of the teams. And the idea was that two things. Each team created a 2-minute video of their big idea, and also had to create an end-to-end implementation plan that sort of took their idea through inception to fulfillment. And they were to be viewed or assessed on the basis of innovation, impact, and actionable. How quickly they could be put into action. And so this is just wrapped up. The videos were made available online to all of our Dentons colleagues. Over 15,000 views of the videos of these 24
And everybody
videos.
got to vote.
And everybody got to vote.
So everybody had a say in what idea, whether it was someone in Paris or someone in, any other part of the world. It was very heartening to see same sort of pieces of thought. For example, flexible working arrangement. Awesome. People have same problems anywhere in the world. They want more innovative ideas. So everyone got to vote on it.
Yeah, and that was actually the winning solution. So in addition to the votes on the videos, the global leadership team, and again, I was happy to be part of that, assessed the end-to-end implementation plans. And out of that, the winning team is with the global board in Madrid this week, celebrating and taking forward. Now, we're going to action all 24 of those proposals or plans. One that I was involved in that is very germane to the conversation today is a team that included colleagues from Australia, from Hawaii, across the US, Canada, and in Europe on exploring innovative ideas that have taken hold within Dentons and that we have, in most cases, either co-developed with clients or have shared with clients, so have enhanced our ability to deliver client service, and then dissect and look at how inclusion and diversity help to drive that exercise. It's remarkable. We have what's called an innovation exchange on our portal, and we have about 60 innovative solutions. The vast majority of them, when you slice through it and see who was involved in creating the idea and how it came to fruition, incredibly diverse and very inclusive. And the whole exercise, and I apologize for going on at some length, was a refreshing reinforcement or a compelling reminder of just how powerful, as well as fun, and we're allowed to have fun, we should have fun in what we do,
absolutely.
It is to work with a diverse team who, I've never met most of the people I was chatting with, but it brought into the fore all of those elements of psychological safety. There's automatic deference to a global board member or somebody, who's senior member of the firm, and you have to overcompensate by stepping back and saying, no, I really want to hear what you have to say, and if I understood you correctly, you're saying this, and what do other people think about that idea? Anyway, thank you for indulging me.
No, absolutely. One of my favorite ones was. It was never going to win, but creating a recipe book of all the favorite different kinds of foods from around the world. I was like, if someone would create that recipe book, I would love to have that. But just how through culture you can have people get involved so much. It was really exciting to see. You both are leaders in your own fields, and you are leading not only the charge of diversity and inclusion, but the industries in your fields. Bindu, maybe you can talk to us about some of the things, either through mentors you've had over the years that you've learned and that you're implementing in your organization that is leading to innovation and diversity.
Well, I do want to put a shout out there to those in the majority, right? So the white men do actually create opportunities. And I will say, so many of my opportunities have come because one of them gave me a chance, right? And allowed me and encouraged me to be myself. And to bring my whole self to work and in all of its glory and awesomeness every day. And probably humored me with some of the crazier ideas, but then gave me just enough rope to sort of get out there and do it or hang myself, whichever way it works. So I will say, I think it does come. And it for me, that those couple of people in my life have helped me sort of push down some of the walls that I probably created around myself about being afraid of being different, of standing out, and one of them was really interesting. This was, I don't know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and he was so surprised as we were trying to stand up this diversity and inclusion initiative at the firm, and we were talking to him about, trying to make the business case and what we would do to like advance this. So this was a few years ago. Now the business case seems to have been largely established at most firms, certainly at Dentons, maybe not everybody. But I remember talking to him.
The way.
But I remember talking to him about this, and this is, sort of a man of a certain amount of privilege, talking about the fact that, I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to do this, and why wouldn't you want to leverage all of your connections, like, to me, he was saying, to women's groups and the Indian community, et cetera. And I was just like, dude, for the last 15 years, I've been trying to make sure you didn't notice that I was different, right? And I was trying to blend in, and I went to the right schools, and I don't have an accent, and I didn't have any of this, and I got all this advice to never talk about your children, and never do this, and never do all of these things. And for him to say, I don't understand why you wouldn't just be yourself at work, was really insightful, because he never had to be anything other than himself at work or in many places. But it was also a little bit of a wake-up call of like, well, that's what he's doing, and maybe I'm going to pay a price for being myself, or maybe it will be my freedom. And for me, it really was my freedom. And so I think about that, and I think about what people in positions of privilege, whether that's organizationally within your company or your organization, or by virtue of who you are, or socioeconomically, or wherever it is, age now for me. I realize I'm old, I'm a senior lawyer. And so I think
in
about-
our profession, that's a privilege.
And there aren't so many of us, but I do think about what I can do with that privilege, and how I can exercise it, and how I can share it and bring that to other people. Because it's not about just lifting up people like me, but rather it's putting myself out there and using that to kind of lift everybody else up. And Chris, you use the word fairness, and I think about, inclusion and fairness are almost like homonyms, right? Like they're kind of the same word, or they can be. And I think about, it's imperative to me to create that place of like comfort within my teams, because it doesn't matter who they are. And I've had the opportunity, or possibly the struggle of having many new teams over many new years, but what's the commonality, right? It doesn't really matter exactly who's part of the team. We can spend all of our time, and I think the Aristotle project was really interesting. They spent a lot of time trying to construct the perfect teams, but it almost didn't matter who was on the team. It was about what you did and created in the environment. And I think by the privilege that I have had, or that I have now, but maybe didn't feel like I had, but realized that I could sort of take everything that was different or unique about me and see that as a way to bring other people in. I'm not living everybody's life. I may not get what your slice of diversity is and how that's different, but I can totally understand and empathize with the fact that it can be hard to sometimes share that. And how do we create a place in the work environment where we want to share that, if you want to share that. But even if you don't want to share it, that you feel comfortable enough to not share it and to be yourself. So I don't know if I said anything particularly practical, but I think it comes from a deep place of interest and appreciating who you are and how you can have that impact on others.
Absolutely. It's about, part of it is understanding that, right? Like, which is the key, I find. Just creating that awareness amongst leaders, amongst people who have that privilege, to be able to create that environment where other people can talk about it. So Julian, perhaps you can talk about your organization a bit and how you have used your privilege in a position of leadership, in a position of having a diverse background, and what is it that you are doing to be able to pass that forward and create the psychological safety environment?
So, I mean, I think I would echo so much of what Bindu said. I would say that, to personalize it, I would say that I try to reflect on it on a regular basis, as do both of you, I know. When I think about the opportunity I have, I think about something Bindu talked about, which was the people who have been generous to me in my career, who have mentored me and given me freedom and opportunity. And I look at those situations and think I need to figure out how to pay that forward. And that, I would absolutely echo your sentiments about that feeling of early in my career, I would say I did not feel comfortable presenting my whole authentic self at work. And now that I have the freedom to do it, I really do my best to do it because I think it helps others. Yep. The reason why I think it helps others is sort of twofold. The first thing I'd say is I believe that it helps others who don't share my dimensions of diversity to understand my dimensions of diversity. Yeah. It helps us, and I would say vice versa, but it helps us to have a dialogue about those things. The other end of it is people who do share some of my elements of diversity, gender would be one. I think that it gives them that psychological safety to say, you know what, you should feel comfortable talking about who you are, what your life is, and what your own personal demands are relative to work. And my example, I mean, my team we are very focused on getting to field trips. It's a very important thing for us as a group. I don't know that same conversation was had 10 or 20 years ago, but as a group, we have created this environment where everybody is able to prioritize their family life, have flexible hours, figure out what works for them in order to achieve both their personal and their professional goals. And I do think that we are all in a position where we can create that safe environment where people feel like they can raise these issues. One of the other things I try to do, frankly, even when I don't agree with the issues being raised, I realize that I have a seat at a table where not everybody is there. Even when I don't believe in the perspective being raised by somebody, I will take the opportunity to say, look, this isn't my view. However, this is feedback I'm getting from other people, and I don't want to discount it, and I don't want to dismiss it. Maybe I don't support it, but it should be a voice that's at the table, even if those people aren't there. So that's another kind of way I try to use my position. And the last thing I'd say is, in terms of hiring, and I'm talking outside of the legal group, although we do it within the legal group as well, we can have policies and targets and all that good stuff. Practically speaking, I really encourage people to have a wide variety of representation in their hiring process. So it's easy to say, I'd like to find a lawyer just like me who thinks the same way and does the same things, and then I don't have to supervise them. That's kind of an easy way to go. It doesn't bring out the best in your team. It doesn't make you better. It doesn't challenge you in any way. When you have sort of a diverse hiring group, when you talk as a group about what do you think is important? Like, I think this is important, but what do you think is important? I just find I learn every time from that conversation. I think, you think about what you need. You have to think about what everybody else needs too, what other things that, they can see bring value. So when you have that diverse group, I'm often shocked at the sort of feedback that comes after interviews. You have like 6 different people do the interviews, and I know firms do this as well. The things that I thought were great are not necessarily the things that other people thought were great. And so you need that holistic view in order to find the best person. And further, I'd say kind of the corollary to that is then set them up for success. So Absolutely. To go out and identify diverse candidates for the sake of identifying diverse candidates it's a disservice to your organization. It's a disservice to the candidate.
It's a real waste.
It's such a waste. And it's so detrimental, right? You've set them up for failure. You have to think about, hey, if we wanted to come, as an example, if I wanted to go out and hire a change agent, set them up for success, right? Like, if you really want change, you've got to support them in doing whatever you've asked them to do. Or a diverse candidate, you want them to show whatever their alternative perspective is. You got to set them up for success and tell them how to, get people to listen and how to get people to buy in.
Absolutely. I think that is the sort of the next phase of the challenge in inclusion and diversity. I think most of us realize that it's important when you're hiring to hire a diverse group of people. But then how do you retain them? How do you create that environment? How do you challenge them and ensure that they have the same luxury of making those mistakes and feeling safe in making those mistakes without being judged based on their difference of gender or sexual orientation or difference of background, upbringing, economic strata, and that's mentors play such a huge role in that, and I can personally speak to it. Like, there's no way I would have succeeded if I hadn't had the mentorship of people who allowed me to challenge their ideas and didn't say, well, what do you know? Whether it was a white male senior person or some other form of privileged person, know better, right? If they hadn't had created that environment, there was no way for someone like me to succeed. And that is really what the next phase of diversity and inclusion is all about. I'm going to open this up for questions from the audience, and I think we have people online as well. If there are any questions of our panel, any thoughts that you want to share, yes, please.
First, thank you all very much. This is engaging and I think very.
You need the mic. Sorry.
You need the mic.
First, thank you very much. This is a really engaging and relevant discussion, so thanks for your time on this. My instinct is that the majority of the people who are in this room truly understand and value diversity and inclusion and see the importance of promoting that within their organizations. And I'm wondering if you might be able to share with us some tips or successes that you've had in engaging others within your organization who maybe don't put D&I initiatives at the top of their priority list.
I think this is for Bindu and Julian, really. Why don't you take this?
I would say that I think having a conversation about inclusion is one way to tackle this, right? When we start talking about diversity, it can be about making sure we have all of the colors, all of the different crayons in the box, right? And that somehow if we tick boxes and people get points for certain elements of their diversity, I actually have never felt that any of this was an advantage, but I have been accused of having gotten ahead because, you're a visible minority woman, and I'm like, what? In what universe is that actually a benefit here? But that, so
it's a double whammy.
So yeah, it's like a positive. Negative means positive. But I think when we start talking about inclusion, then we can actually have better conversations. And there's that book called Covering by Kenji Yoshino, and he talks about the fact that we all have different elements that we're not comfortable necessarily sharing at work. And when we start talking about all of the things that we each might have that either we can choose to not disclose, or we can maybe not be seen for, or it's not a dimension that is commonly discussed, to your point about sort of the more common elements. When we all realize that we've got something that might hold us back a little bit at work or might make us feel like we're a bit different, when we all have that, then suddenly we can have a lot more empathy, social sensitivity, psychological safety, and I think that that's really important. I will say what's been very interesting is I live here, but I'm spending a lot of time in Alberta, which, if you observed what happened in the last federal election, went very differently than the GTA. And I literally, watched the election results on the Monday night, and I got off the plane in Edmonton on Tuesday morning, and it was notable. Like, it was one of those things where I realized we're all working together and we're all kind of driving in the same direction. But wow, do we ever live in a very diverse country? And you wouldn't necessarily know, except when you have a moment to sort of measure that. But the conversations that people were having the next day with my colleagues in Edmonton versus the conversations I'd been having in Toronto with my friends and neighbors were just so different. And yet we all live in the same country, and we all ideally, I think, want the same thing, although I might need a passport the next time I go back to Edmonton, but that's a whole different story. But I would just say that I think trying to find commonality without minimizing difference, because that's not the point, but appreciating that we all have something that, that makes us unique. We are all special little snowflakes on some level or another, be it by your politics or your age or where you grew up or your urban or rural or your this or your that, your sexuality, your race, your religion, we could go down any, like a 1,000 items. But I think by sort of talking about inclusion, it is actually more inclusive. It gets us to where we want to do.
So, Jillian, have you converted a non-believer to a believer or had the opportunity to see that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say, I think this is a skill for lawyers generally, but the way I approach it is I try to speak to whatever is going to speak to that particular individual. If fairness and equity is going to appeal to them, I will have a fairness and equity conversation. If the business case is going to appeal to them, then I'm going to have the business case conversation. But figuring out, what is going to resonate with the person you're trying to persuade is probably the most effective way to get there.